Here we are for another Goodwill Report interim survey. We do 2 of these a year. This is the interim one, as we're 6 months into the year. And we're here today just to kind of give you a bit of an idea what the market's doing, where the market's been, and a kind of an idea about, I guess, exit planning and how you can use the report to your benefit. You may read in the market that, or you may be reading several reports in the market on how information is illustrated. And I think one of the key things that we kind of want to iron out at the outset of this is how we report our data. And I think, Phil, you had quite a good example on that.
Yeah, so I think it's really key to understand the difference between fair maintainable trade or adjusted net profit and EBITDA. And them two types of valuations are completely different. So what I'm just going to do is explain a typical NHS practice. So let's say somebody has 7,000 UDAs at, let's say, 30 quid a UDA. So you've got 210k turnover. Roughly, a principal working in there can do all 7,000 UDAs. They're probably going to make a profit of a region of £105,000 a year. So what we would do is we'd apply a multiple. For this illustration, let's go with a 4 times FMT multiple. That gets you to a value of 420k for the business. So let's say we found a buyer. They were going to work in there. They pay 420,000. That is how we would report a fair maintainable trade or an adjusted net profit multiple. Now, conversely, if we work out that if it's 105k principal-led profit, we factor in associate fees of 84k, you've pretty much got an EBITDA on that practice of 21k. Now, to achieve a 420k purchase price, that realistically means that somebody would be buying it at 20 times EBITDA. So if you're reporting within your figures, that practice selling for 20 times is going to massively overinflate your EBITDA figures. So I guess the difference between us and other reports in the market is we separate any sale that's sold to an individual working in the business, and then we separate sales to corporate or group buyers who buy on an EBITDA basis. So the real difference is our FMT figures show sales completely to independents. So if you get a valuation from us, you should see similar multiples appear on your valuations if you're selling to an individual and you're an individual style practice. And likewise, if you've got, let's say, an EBITDA of 300k, you're more than likely going to fit into our EBITDA or investor-led multiples as demonstrated within the report. So does that kind of sum up the difference between kind of why we see some reports which show that practices are selling at 13, 14, 15 times EBITDA, when the reality is they're not? It's just how stats are being reported to show greater EBITDA and try and attract you to get a valuation, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's nail on the head, isn't it? I think what's important is that headline figures can be quite misleading. And if you're reading that practices are achieving 13, 14, 15 times, the reality of it is anyone in the market as a broker, as a banker, as an accountant knows that's what the market's doing. But if you're new to the market looking at selling and you're reading those headlines, you could be disappointed when it comes to your valuation, because ultimately they're not the kind of multiples they've achieved. It's just how the data is illustrated, as you say. So no, I think that's it's a good explanation. So we have put that in the report just as a kind of an idea, so you kind of understand the report, I guess, when we're going through it. To kind of, we're not going to go into the report in too much detail today, but there's probably a few key highlights I think that are worth mentioning. And I think if you look at the last sort of 12 to 18 months, we're still seeing strong demand for practices. Despite of high interest rates and corporate mergers. In fact, the average purchase price has only dropped by 50k when we look at the last 6 months completed deals. So actually, given those market fluctuations at the moment, that's a fairly negligible drop when you consider that base rates has increased from 1% to 5.25% in the last 18 months alone. From
the buyer's perspective, on a £1 million lent, they're probably the interest rate's circa 23k higher just in extra interest. So that's straight off the bottom, the back pocket of somebody buying. So for the multiples only to soften, and that's the word that I'd use, soften slightly, and for purchase price to remain the same, really shows what kind of market we're in. We're in a really resilient market. We're in a market which has high demand, because ultimately demand drives multiples, right? Nothing else drives multiples other than demand. So it shows that the demand is there for the multiples to remain kind of steady. A slight softening in some cases. Mainly, I think the softening is on the group side, though, if we look at the data, and that's really because of the mergers more than anything. Is there's been a lot of corporate mergers knocking out the competition. If two of the big players merge together, they're doing that for one reason, and that's to look to drive multiples down if possible. And of course, some groups have exited from the market for a period of time. Now, speaking to the groups on a monthly basis, I think the future will see them groups come back in 2024, and already some are gearing up to re-enter and looking at prospectuses and seeing what's on the market. So again, I think we're in almost a mini bubble or a mini cycle, which I think come the start of 2024, that cycle will only look to improve. And I think if we fast forward a year, I'm going to be interested to see where these multiples are. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if they were, if not the same, slightly higher.
Yeah. I think that's it. And I think this is where it's quite important to understand the data, isn't it? Because if we look at the last 3 years since post-COVID, where multiples did rise significantly because of that bottleneck. There was a big demand from first-time buyers, second-time buyers, groups keen to grow. Money was still cheap, so we did see multiples go. So actually, if you compare multiples to the year end, to almost 2021, to where we are now, they have taken an average dip of 0.96 times, which is almost one turn down. Now that sounds bad when you look at it like that, but actually, when you look at the data on a more granular basis, what's happening is, and again, you're out seeing practices all the time, is that actually there's certain practices are now less attractive. They're not achieving the same multiples, but actually what we are seeing on the polar opposite of that is practices that do fit the bill are achieving similar multiples what they were 2 or 3 years ago.
The biggest thing is there's been a shift in how buyers look at the opportunities, and that's because of interest rates rising. If you're looking to buy a business and you're paying, base rate was 0.25 and you were paying the average, let's say Lloyd's 2.23 on top of that, is dental practices were very, very sure businesses, almost risk-free, some may say. The difference is now with base rate is there is a risk attached. And I think that's the word that almost was unheard of 3 years ago, risk, to now the word that we hear on every single call is there's a risk to this practice. So the practices that are achieving the highest multiples are the ones that have mitigated risk. So, for example, the principal dentist isn't doing 70% of the private work. They haven't fallen short on their UDA targets year on year. There's room to grow so that somebody can look to buy the business and increase that EBITDA and benefit from the arbitrage when they come to sell. So realistically, if you're in the market, my biggest piece of advice was limit the risk or perceived risk a buyer would look at. Is there scope for them to grow? Make sure you're hitting your UDA target. Make sure that you've brought in associates to mitigate the risks should something happen. All of these group buyers, their ideal practice is a principal dentist who's doing 20% of the revenue themselves, the remainder done by hygienists and associates. That mitigates their risk, but it also mitigates your risk because that income spread means that you've got a greater chance of earning your earn-out period and any deferred elements, and ultimately becomes a business which is more attractive for somebody else. So I think risk is the biggest word that's come into the market, and practices that have mitigated that and are opportune practices for somebody to buy are still performing. I mean, we've just completed on a practice, fully private practice, revenue, let's say 3 to 5 million, and it achieved 8.21 times because it was that perfect practice. Similarly, if we just go to the owner-occupier market, NHS practices and mixed practices, their multiples are still really high, and that's because people still love that NHS guaranteed income. They love the scope to grow the private, and then multiples, as you'll see further on in the report, which are broken down by area, are still really high. So biggest piece of advice is mitigate risk. If you're doing all of the income, look to bring in associates over the next year to mitigate that. It will be of a real benefit.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And I guess it's important for people to maybe see why there is a softening in some areas, because I guess we bang on about interest rates, and that's what everyone's talking about at the moment. But ultimately that's not the reason why multiples are dipping. The demand dips slightly, but ultimately there's certain type of practices that will always sell. But I guess the difficulty at the moment and the biggest problem and the biggest challenge is recruitment still. And I think that's where there has probably been a knock-on impact on some practices, because now if you've got 26, 27 quid a UDA paying out 13, 14 quid a UDA, that's in an area that's difficult to recruit, or even an area that is good to recruit, your margin isn't as good as it was. And I guess it's not that practice is now unsellable. It's the fact that you're probably not getting the 7.5, 8 times that you would have got maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that you're now getting closer to that sort of 6.5, 7 times in some cases. So I guess it's not that it sounds all doom and gloom when we talk about there's a drop, but it's actually not that bad. It's the fact that the market's still there for it. It's just not as good as it was, I guess.
Yeah, and that's why we're looking at this report. You know, it's very easy to just look at a number and then say, oh, I'm in the Midlands. You know, their average is 4.1. You know, that means that my practice is worth 4.1. But the biggest 4.1 times, the biggest thing to really highlight in this report is multiples aren't just based on the average of what we value practices. There's a lot that go into multiples. It's area. Is it in a health centre? Is it shopfront location? Is it in a residential area? Is the income year on year tracking at a growth level of 5 to 10%? Is there scope to add more surgeries? You know, what's the risk profile on the income? Have they delivered the NHS contract year on year? You know, these are all the types of questions that we ask ourselves within a valuation panel before we put a multiple on that business. So really my biggest piece of advice is, if you're looking at this report or any report, is really don't take the multiples by region or income as that's going to be the multiple that we apply, because there are several factors that really go into the decision making. Of course, we look at comparable data, but there's a whole other load of questions that really become quite crucial when, you know, we're on valuation panel and yourself and Luke and I are deciding what multiple effectively we want to put on the business.
And there's one point that you mentioned earlier, that buyers are becoming more risk averse now. You know, that's something that has, and not that buyers weren't before, but they're becoming more, I guess, risk averse than what they ever had been. Now, if I'm a seller now, considering an exit strategy, but how has that changed for me, I guess, since, you know, with buyers becoming a bit more risk averse?
Well, I think we've got to remember they're becoming more risk averse, but that doesn't mean that they still wouldn't look at the opportunity. Ultimately, dental practices are very profitable businesses, and in most cases, you know, that goodwill up there, whether it be attached to an NHS contract or by a loyal patient base, is likely going to continue. So if I'm a seller out there, I'd be looking at what are the risks and what can I do preparing to sale. And that is, you know, getting recruitment, sorting out the NHS contract, making sure that you're on target to deliver that NHS contract, making sure that you're fully recruited for your members of staff, making sure that you've got up-to-date accounts and information. The key is preparation, and I guess the key in my eyes is to don't do it alone. Get a valuer in, let them provide you with a valuation and how a buyer will look at it. So if I'm a seller, I'd be saying, well, Phil, how would a buyer perceive my practice? And then what can I do in the next 6 to 12 months? You know, can't really do anything overnight. What can I do in the next 6 to 12 months to prepare to mitigate them risks? And one thing that we do is obviously provide a health check report, which is free of charge, no obligation. One of our 5 valuers on the road will come out. They'll do a full review. In that report, there is a traffic light system which shows where your gross profit margin is, where your expenses lie. Are you too high on certain things? What's the NHS delivery? How will they look at that? And that will give you an idea of what you can do to look to improve it. I think that's the most useful tool that we offer to sellers and work with, in some cases 5 to 10 years, you know, before they come to sell. And that would be my big piece of advice. Is it's hard to know the risks until somebody analyzes them and really gives you their market opinion, doing this day in, day out.
And I guess off the back of that, then, you know, is that if you are looking at selling in the next 5 years, you really need to be looking at that now, because depending on the type of practice that you've got, the kind of buyer that you're most likely to attract, and how that income is distributed across the practice and what risk, I guess, there is there, it could mean that if you're planning on retiring in 5 years and you don't get a valuation for 4 years, the risk is that you could be tied in for 3 or 4 years. So it's about a fight. Reality is probably a 5-year plan, isn't it? Is what people really need to be looking at.
Unless you're a small practice, you know, if you're a small to medium-sized practice where you're going to have a owner-occupier come in and take that lead position, okay, and take so anywhere between a value of 100k to, let's say, circa just over £1 million, is you're going to pretty much fit into that box of probably being an individual, maybe a micro consolidator in the area, look to buy, and they're going to give you a lot more favourable terms and maybe a 6 months, 12 months stay on, but not linked to any kind of payment. You'll get 100% up front. But if you are a larger practice, really looking at it now for 5 years is certainly a sensible plan.
Real. Okay. Well, thanks, Phil. And the valuation, I say valuation, if you're not going to book a valuation, then do get in touch. And the report is available to download. So any questions, please do get in touch.
Bro, thanks a lot. Cheers.
Yes, thank you.